I'm going to introduce my colleague, Marcie Campbell. Marcie was a national research coordinator for our domestic homicide research grant and part of the initial application team, and I should say applications because we tried to get this grant for some time. She's also a member of the Domestic Homicide Death Review Committee in Ontario, and she currently works as a student counselor and counseling supervisor at York University in Toronto. Welcome, Marcie, and together Marcie and I are going to share a PowerPoint. As Myrna indicated, this conference is divided up into three phases. Yesterday you heard about the database research and some of the findings. Today we're going to talk about the survey and interviews with key informants. It's important to indicate at the outset that protecting victims from escalating domestic violence and domestic homicide is critical and clearly takes a whole village to protect the victim. So if you look at the different service providers, clearly this is not just a role for the courts or the police alone, but clearly there's multiple agencies and also the support of friends, family, neighbors, and coworkers that are going to be critical. Just a thought about all the people involved in dealing with domestic violence. Obviously, there's specialists, there's people that we have great expectations for in terms of the violence against women sector, the shelters, the advocates involved in outreach, programs for abusers, programs for children exposed to domestic violence, police, family and criminal courts, and victim services and corrections. Then there's a number of generalists that need to know enough to make referrals and ask some of the basic questions in terms of screening, such as family doctors, educators, mental health professionals, social service professionals, lawyers. And clearly there's a number of challenges in the field. What is the standard of practice? Is domestic violence something that is nice to know about, or is this mandatory training? So, for example, the police and corrections across Canada are the only groups that tend to have mandatory training and guidelines. Is the training one time only? If you covered this in social work or in psychology, you know it, or is this part of ongoing education for professionals? And to what extent is there cross-training in terms of working with individuals across different sectors so agencies aren't working in silos? Clearly, there's some important questions about the extent to which we screen for domestic violence, and then our expectations of people who actually complete a full risk assessment. And then another important issue is to what extent do risk assessments lead to safety planning and risk management? And these are questions that we considered in doing our research. Some of the challenges, just to highlight some, and again, Marcie and I will be available during the Q&A period at 4:15. We found with some people we interviewed, they had to get permission from a supervisor to be part of the interview. Some worried that this was a test about their knowledge. We found great variability in the tools that were being used across jurisdiction. We found that people used the same terms for very different things. We had to constantly reassure people, as we did through our ethics and our research, about confidentiality. And we faced some limited participation in some sectors. Very few judges or lawyers who completed the survey. And clearly a big theme throughout was intersectionality, as Jordan and Danielle and Myrna talked about yesterday. And again, just to put intersectionality in context, actually, the far left box should say Indigenous, but also refers to child protection, because obviously there's major themes in terms of addressing issues within Indigenous communities and recognizing the impact of colonization and intergenerational trauma. Obviously, in rural communities, looking at the issues around limited privacy and issues around access to firearms. Immigrant refugee populations looking at migration stress and pre-migration trauma, and with children looking at the issues around their dependency and concerns about being taken away by child protection or victims losing custody within the family court setting. So these are themes that we came back to repeatedly. These are all outlined in our literature review that Myrna Dawson referred to yesterday, and we'll return to these themes today. Now I'm going to turn things over to Marcie to talk about what we actually did in terms of our survey and interviews. Marcie, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. I think this is the first time, because Peter's doing the slides for me, that Peter's actually working for me. In terms of the National Online Survey, we had just over 1,400 survey respondents. Just over half of those, about 52%, were from Ontario, which is a limitation with this study. We had 36% come from the Western provinces, with most coming from Alberta, then BC, Saskatchewan, and then Manitoba. Atlantic Canada accounted for 4%, Quebec accounted for 3%, and territories had 2%. In terms of the survey, it comprised of 12 questions regarding risk assessment, risk management, and safety planning practices, as well as the work with the 4 vulnerable populations we identified. After the respondents completed the online survey, they were given an option to volunteer to participate in an in-depth interview. And 35% of those who completed the survey volunteered to participate in the interview. Next slide, Peter, please. The majority of survey responders came from the violence against women sector and shelter services, followed by police and victim services, mental health and healthcare professionals, and child protection. Next slide, please. So the survey findings were that 8 out of 10 professionals who completed the survey stated that they used a structured risk assessment tool. Also, the majority identified that they work with one or more of the identified vulnerable groups that we identified in this study. It was also shown that there was great variation between systems and agencies in terms of risk assessment, risk management, and safety planning. And one example is with the police. 72% of police reported that they do use a standardized risk assessment tool. However, they indicated that they used 12 different tools. Most often they would use the ODERA, but they would also use Be Safer, the SARA, and the Danger Assessment. So some major themes that were identified in the survey were in terms of challenges and barriers to risk assessment, risk management, and safety planning were a system overload, lack of resources, outdated policies and practices, tools not matching with diverse communities, worker burnout, an inconsistency across sectors and agencies and within agencies, reluctant survivors and abusers, and a lack of collaboration. So I'll be talking about these themes in the next upcoming slides. So challenges and barriers to risk assessment, risk management, and safety planning was first system overload. And this quote talks about, from a respondent, talks about an increased workload, complex cases, very high-risk cases, and heightened emotion and stress when dealing with these cases. So there's a definite system overload. And it also leads to a theme that was identified about worker burnout, especially if workers didn't receive training or they lack the confidence in their own abilities to do a risk assessment or risk management or safety planning, or to even deal with intimidating perpetrators. This is something that's discussed in a presentation this afternoon, especially around child protection workers. Next slide, please. So in terms of risk assessment, risk management, safety planning tools in general, this quote talks about how tools are very lengthy, they are awkward, they can be time consuming, and it's difficult to build trust and rapport and have like a natural conversation when you have to click off, a formal checklist. So as a counselor in the university, I can see up to 6 clients a day. and for 50-minute sessions. So that doesn't leave me with a lot of time to actually build trust and rapport, engage with the client, and complete a thorough assessment or risk management or safety plan. The next quote talks about the theme of inconsistency that was brought up with survey respondents, and that there's inconsistency between and within agencies in terms of tools being used or practices, and professionals being trained or using different tools or not having tools at all. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you, Peter. So this theme about one size does not fit all. In this quote by a respondent, they talk about how the risk is specific to a city or a region, and they can be very different. And they talk about the changing variables in the community, such as substance use changes, increased gang activity, human trafficking, and an increasing number of methadone clinics. So these are changing variables that need to be taken into consideration whenever assessing risk, or also implementing or developing a risk management strategy or safety plan. And again, this quote about, we find that the questions of tools are not fairly geared towards the experiences of Indigenous and immigrant women. So risk assessment tools and strategies were not developed necessarily for specific populations or unique lived experiences of diverse communities or clients. Tools and strategies may not be culturally sensitive, and some might not work from an anti-oppressive framework. They may not take into account the changing situations of the family or available and accessible resources. As an example, research on predictive validity of standardized risk assessment tools has mainly been done in North America and applied to the majority population. So what this theme is saying is that we really need to look outside of the box when we're doing risk assessment, risk management, or safety planning. And this is discussed further in the presentations this afternoon on cultural considerations of offender treatment, risk assessment, and trauma within immigrant refugee communities, and safety planning using an intersectional approach. So the next tool, adapting tools. Again, it speaks to this quote from a respondent: "I would love a relevant risk assessment tool. However, most do not suit the communities I deal with." You know, that speaks to the one size doesn't fit all approach. And then the quote from the responder next speaks to not using a formal standardized tool or providing a score in the case it provides the client with a false sense of security if the score is not high. So they speak about looking at general risk factors pulled from tools and having a discussion and implementing safety strategies specific to their unique and changing situations. So I think about sometimes when I speak to other service providers, they tell me that they actually use the risk factors that are identified by the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee. We have 41 risk factors that are identified and presented in our annual reports. And I've heard from service providers that sometimes they will use that report in order to assess risk rather than using a standardized risk assessment tool. In a university setting, they were looking to actually adopt a standardized tool, risk assessment tool, but they found that none really captured the specific risks and culture of a young population and dating violence, or the diversity of students on campus. So the thought was maybe that we needed to implement a bunch of tools or create our own tool. So these points really discuss, these points are really discussed in the next slide about needing a tailored approach and to think outside the box to address the unique lived experience and social locations of clients and families. So this quote actually talks about, there's many tools, assessments, and strategies that are well studied, but not very applicable to the client population that we serve. And using formulaic safety plans for the most part do not make sense if clients have low literacy, no access to a phone, no money, live in a fly-in community, or have no services to help them. So this speaks to another theme that was brought up in terms of a lack of resources. So it's difficult to have a tailored approach or to even have an effective safety plan, risk management strategy, or assessment when there's not any appropriate or there's a lack of resources. So things like services being inaccessible, having no funding, no specialized service providers, having very long wait lists for programs, or a lack of culturally specific services, just to name a few. And another theme that came up in terms of barriers and challenges to risk assessment, risk management, and safety planning is reluctant survivors and perpetrators. So oftentimes families from diverse populations have a mistrust in systems such as child protection or police. Indigenous peoples can mistrust child protection due to the disproportionate amount of Indigenous children that are in the foster system. The existence of systemic racism causes reluctance with families to work with service providers. And other issues may be dependency on the perpetrator or fear of being ostracized from their community. And the final slide that I'm going to talk about is the power of collaboration. So this respondent said that the best asset in mitigating risk is collaboration with interagencies and not working in silos. And this was one of the themes that came up, in that there is sometimes a lack of collaboration with agencies. And this may be due to some organizations having different mandates and different policies and practices, and concerns around information sharing and confidentiality issues. So again, this is further discussed in more detail in the presentations this afternoon. So back to you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you, Marcie. And just to come back to some of the themes, after we did our survey, we had a number of people interview. We had 366 key informant interviews from across Canada, obviously dominated by the violence against women sector, but also healthcare, police, victim services, and child protection. We were able to do interviews across the country, obviously many from Ontario, but we had good representation from Quebec and representation from coast to coast to coast. Some major themes from the interviews really had us, we were able to go beyond the survey findings, and there was themes about the need to have clear policies and practices and protocols between and amongst different agencies who are working together to protect victims and children, and also provide interventions for abusers. There's obviously a need for more training opportunities, a theme that came up consistently, and accountability for workers. So there was a lot of inconsistency. So clearly we heard about some outstanding practices, but even in one police service or one healthcare service, you weren't guaranteed to get consistent service providers providing consistent standards of practice. A lack of collaboration, as Marcie just said, between different service providers, and many victims and many service providers complained about working in silos, even in the justice system, the criminal court and the family court, not knowing what the right hand and left hand were doing, a lack of coordination and safety planning and risk management strategies, and appropriate sharing of information. And a big theme throughout is a lack of any kind of intersectional practice. So clearly, when we look at the research that we did, and you're going to hear a number of presentations shortly that dive into each one of these topics in more detail, it's clear to many of us that the research really points us in a certain direction, and we have clear theories around intersectionality, but there is still a big gap between theory and practice, and obviously we need to build a better map and then follow that map to get to better informed practice and better standards. Some themes that come back repeatedly. Training and more training. And when we talk about training, Having an awareness session about domestic violence is no longer what's needed. One needs training that deals with victims, perpetrators, children exposed to domestic violence, how to do risk assessment. So the training needs to be much more intensive, much more hands-on in terms of actually using tools. There needs to be better resources in place. Obviously, what we heard repeatedly, certainly for those working in rural and remote communities or working with Indigenous communities, doing training and recognizing needs can be very frustrating when it doesn't lead to referrals to appropriate resources. So obviously a need to recognize the unique needs of different marginalized populations. And certainly the themes we saw throughout the country was the shortage of services for Indigenous women, services that would be culturally appropriate. We also see many barriers to immigrant victims and perpetrators and children who are facing major barriers by language, by culture, that are going to be very challenging. Clearly a need for enhanced collaboration and information sharing across systems and agencies. And certainly we got one message repeatedly from the violence against women sector, that often there was valuable information available by the police who had done a risk assessment, but that information was kept within the justice system, and that information wasn't reliably shared with the other sectors. And we see people continuing to work in silos, which in fact further endangers victims of domestic violence. There's a lack of agreement on risk assessment tools and sharing findings across systems. So there's multiple tools. There is some emerging research across the US talking about getting all sectors to agree on 6 or 7 major risk factors, even for basic screenings, which would lead to further assessments. But certainly in Canada, although we have pockets of excellence, and you're going to hear about some ideas from Tracy Porteous shortly, we still feel across the country that people really aren't working together in ways to better protect victims and their children. And again, a key message is that risk assessment is not an end in itself. We found many cases, and this is also a theme we find in our death review committee, where there's an excellent risk assessment done by the police, but it's filed away in the Crown brief, and it doesn't inform community practice in terms of a holistic approach to safety planning and risk management. Again, for more information, you're welcome to reach out to Marcie or myself. And again, I would certainly recommend that you spend some time on our website, the CDHPI website. As Myrna mentioned yesterday, not only is there a very thorough risk assessment, but there's also very thorough, let's go back there. There's also a number of briefs that deal with all the issues that were just discussed. I'm conscious of time, and I'm going to move on. I want to indicate that although the presentation seems rushed, certainly from Marcie's view and my view, we'll have lots of time at 4:15 today to go into much greater detail on this research, and also have a chance to hear more from other presenters who you're going to hear from shortly.